Hello, everyone. Rhys T. Fertiller. We have Chris Allen on the show, the Fantasy Football Predictive Analytics Show. Chris, how's it going?
I'm doing quite well. And again, as I was saying before we got started recording, after the long list of just A-list fantasy analysts that you guys have had on this podcast, and I'm struggling to figure out why y'all came knocking on my door, but I do appreciate it. And I'm happy to sit down and chat with you guys tonight.
Awesome. This is good though, because you're gonna outkick this expectations. I feel it. I'm
And
feeling
that makes one of us, but we'll see what I can do.
it.
Two of us, because I'm with him. How did you get started writing for about fantasy football?
Actually, it was just out of, I guess, sheer curiosity for the most part. This goes back to the 2016 season, if I'm not mistaken. I was playing in a league with both Matt Harmon and Matt Franciscovich, both formerly of NFL Network. And I was just a fan at the time. I had learned about Matt Harmon through, I think it was actually trying to date myself here. Sig Bloom was featured on, I think he was on Chris Harris's podcast. And I think then I was listening to Sig's podcast, and then he had mentioned Matt Harmon. And so then that's how I found out about Matt Harmon. Regardless, long story long. I was in the chat, and we were kind of going back and forth over some games. And it was the 2016, I think it was like week 5 or week 6. It was the Baltimore Ravens like facing Washington. Deshaun Jackson was set to, I guess he was like one of the highest projected wide receivers on the week. The cornerback for the Ravens at the time, Rhys, he was actually, I guess, very poorly graded. Djax was supposed to just completely burn him. And then he wound up going, I think it was like 3 for 38 or something along those lines. But the hindsight analysis afterwards, and I heard this on a number of podcasts that I was listening to the week after, was that it was because of the wind. It's like, oh, there were high winds in the area, 16, 17 miles per hour, or whatever the case was. And that was the reasoning behind it. And at least for me, I've always been one of those guys that once I hear a take, I almost have like it's a visceral reaction to things that just like, if they don't pass the sniff test, like I'll be instantly just like, it doesn't make sense. And I asked the question to both Harmon and Franciscovich. I sent him an email. It's like, has anybody ever dug into this? And since I have a technical background, I have a number of published papers in some journals, and so like doing peer research is just a part of the process. And so I started kind of digging into it, and I found it was a 2011 or 2012 study that was done by Brian Burke, who's director of analytics at ESPN. And at the time, I didn't know who he was. I just happened to find this study from a few years prior that showed adjusted yards per attempt as a function of wind speed. The trend was fairly linear. And folks, like, I've seen it pulled up a number of times that people like to reference. But I shot him an email. I was like, hey, this was from 2012. And like, had you done anything to update this? Are these just averages like across the entire league? Where did you collect stuff? Just general questions. And he responded back. Again, I had no idea who the guy was. I just got his contact information. I went from there. And so, but that was pretty much all I could find. I'd actually seen a couple of like master's thesis or papers on it where people actually dug into betting predictions and how like snow, wind, rain has impacted like the game totals and whatnot. But that was it. So it didn't really seem like it was a huge part of fantasy analysis at the time. And just given my, I guess, natural writing skill, not to say that I'm the best at it, but at least it's something that I had shown a proclivity towards over the past few years. It was something that I started doing. And I worked for a couple of small sites to kind of start off. And I just continue to, I guess, kind of dive into it as I continue to learn more about just fantasy football in general. I'd only started playing fantasy football in 2012, 2013. So the strategy behind fantasy football, I had zero clue. I think that I can still remember my very first fantasy football pick, and it was Rhys. back in, I think it was the 2011 season, shortly before things went immediately downhill for him, which didn't work out well for me. But regardless, I mean, it was something new, and it was something that I really just wanted to learn more about. So I just started putting my thoughts out there. And the more I started diving into it, the more I started to realize how much I didn't know about football, how much I didn't know about statistics that actually mattered to providing relevant analysis for fantasy football. And so from there, it just continued to blossom into just me getting a shot at 4 for 4. And then from there, it really has expanded as I've started to learn more about just again, what stats matter, how to present your arguments, I guess, in a digestible manner, like either on Twitter or just through your written content, and being able to speak with other folks. I mean, like yourself and other people that work for a number of bigger sites, Yahoo, Number Fire, so on and so forth. So that's where I guess I've come to collect all of these websites that I've been able to be a contributor at, and I find myself fortunate through all of it.
We have the Matts are great dudes. Harmon franchise. We were out there. We talked a little bit before we hit record, but when we were in California, those guys were still at NFL Network. Marcus Grant, those guys. So
Yes.
Harmon showing us around. These guys were so cool because you were what?
I was
10.
10. I was 10.
He was, some 10-year-old kid walking through. They were super cool.
Yeah.
It's always a great thing. Two things you mentioned that I want to push in on, if you don't mind. I don't think, all right, first of all, we're getting to the point in fantasy football world where we have too much data. It just like in every other world, I live in the world of IT, and we get too much data, and it's hard to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, right? Some people go too deep, some people go too shallow. Some people make statistics sing and dance where they probably shouldn't. And second of all, we don't do very well in hindsight analysis in the fantasy football world. That's just my take. And, like I look back, I'm like, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? How can I get better? I'm not so sure. We're so focused on, okay, next week, without having this little bit of evaluation of how can I have an iterative process where I get better? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like whether it's self-evaluation or this evaluation of the stat or whatever it is. You have thoughts on either of those two?
Yeah, I would say that. For your first point about I wouldn't say influx, but I'd say just the evolution of analytics and how it's become a much larger part of just the general conversation on Twitter. And to be quite honest, like, of course, I would say that, of course, yes, bring on all the stats. I mean, I have an engineering background. Of course, just give me all the stats. I live in spreadsheets.
Yeah.
But I do think that there comes a point where, again, trying to make a digestible argument and trying to talk to somebody that doesn't have an understanding of even just like predictive stats. I mean, not even getting into the football aspect of it, but just how stats can be used in a predictive nature. I mean, trying to explain to them what expected points mean or completion percentage over expected. I mean, and what that means, or how a single play can impact how a team's projected score, or just or what's the other thing? I guess what is it? They're projected the win totals, or like win models that project like how much chance a team has to win throughout the entire course of a game. I mean, those things are just they're just not just, again, this might sound terrible. It might be just beyond their understanding because they're just not used to seeing things like that. So you do have to kind of tailor your analysis in order to, again, find analogies or find ways to relate in a more efficient manner. Because, again, just trying to throw stats and just say that, hey, well, because the model says this, you have to believe it. It's, well, of course, how do you expect people to react? So I do think that there should be, I guess, a level of understanding that comes with providing some of these statistics and metrics that are put out, and just enough so that people can become used to seeing them as a part of our just general way that we convey how players are doing and how they're not. But I do think, again, going back to, trying to break it all the way down to just yards and touchdowns, interceptions and sacks, I think it's something that people will always be able to relate to. But if you use that as a building block approach to say, well, if they're only completing this many passes or only generating so many yards, this is how you get from the stats that you can collect off of Pro Football Reference or wherever to something like CPOE, EPA per play, something along those lines where you go from the basic to the advanced. But I do think there should be that transition. It's just finding the best path for people to actually get there.
And um, to explain it well. You know, I mean, like we assume everybody knows it.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the uh, game percentage winner. I don't know if that's what it's called. I believe ESPN calls it their FBI. But my
Yeah, I think
question
something along
is,
those lines. Yeah.
I would love to see what, because they run it like thousands of times. I want to see what simulation projects what will happen.
What variables? What you're saying
Right,
is
'cause-
it's only as good as the variables. So you're an engineering background, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yes.
Variables predicted. But then I think of these basic conversations like we had with Rich Rebar a couple weeks ago, and he was like, hey, you know, I only focus on quarterbacks that have rushing ability because that's the only way you're
That's
going to
his
hit
thing.
your
Yeah.
high ceiling. And you know, so then you're thinking, okay, there's 6 quarterbacks every week that have that. I don't mean to minimize it or to dumb it down, or you know, you see these yards before contact, yards after contact. Are those predictive? Probably not, because they're predictive season to season, not week to week. Because
Right.
if Nick Chubb does great after contact, he's going to do great after contact every game he plays. But we can look at how he plays every game and then look, you know, project that forward. All I was getting at is sometimes we get cute. Let me just say it that way. We get cute and we have to say, like Rebar, we love Rich. Rich is such a good guy and he breaks everything down very simply. But you know, maybe these quarterbacks that get you four rushing points plus a half touchdown, maybe that's where you ought to focus on, and the Ryan Fitzpatrick's can help you or whatever. David Carr, I almost call him David Carr, Derek Carr, you know, whoever.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of it, right? Is finding what matters. It's like we can try and either cook up or reference or talk about, just any specific stat, that's under the sun, but really finding or trying to hone in on the collection of stats and metrics that matter and focusing our attention on those. And just like the analogy that you're providing, we can analyze quarterbacks. All the way down to throwing motion, footwork, and all of these different traits. But at the end of the day, when it comes to fantasy production, we've already kind of isolated the things that make up a like I say, high value quarterback in fantasy. If they happen to be able to run, if they can throw a lot of touchdowns, they're efficient with their passes. There's only so many things that kind of get the job done, like at least from that perspective. So if we find those things, not to say that the other things don't matter, it's just that our focus that helps us be able to either put together actionable content or to have arguments that actually progress the conversation to the point where we now need to focus. If we need to focus on a 5th, 6th, or 7th metric, then that's fine. But focusing in on what matters at least helps us on a week-to-week basis in order to isolate those plays or players that will then help us either win championships or get, again, better understand, I guess, fantasy football as a whole.
Yes, and I heard this analogy this week, and now Rhys has another question for you. I heard this today even. It said they called it the ice cream analogy. If I ask 10 people to go to the ice cream store and bring back a gallon, but you all 10 have to agree, they're coming back with chocolate or vanilla. It's going to be the lowest common denominator. And that's what I'm trying to push the boundaries on in fantasy football is make sure that we are doing the best we can, because consensus isn't always the best for the consumer. Just like the ice cream, if that makes sense. You know, that the person sitting at home, you know, like, vanilla again? You know, can you find some cookie dough for me? Or
yeah, exactly. Where's the sherbet at?
Exactly. But you know what I'm saying. And so that's all I was trying to push the boundary of thought on is how do we get from here to there so that we're distilling what matters and what doesn't.
And I think there are some pieces that, especially folks like JJ Zacharyson
Mhm.
and folks along those lines that I think accomplish two of the things that you were talking about earlier, where they'll go back and try and find those statistics that matter, the metrics that matter, at least help us to better understand or isolate some of those players. But then they also do that check on their process to figure out, well, if this is a metric that I need to consider, how do I work that into my process? Or what are the things about my process that I was missing so that I can understand like how I can better formulate, I guess, the type of actionable content that will help my readers, my subscribers, or whomever like in the coming seasons. I try and do the same for my quarterback streaming column that I have over at 444, because each week before I even get into the recommendations for that week, I structure my piece so that the recommend any of my plays from the week prior, they're front and center, so you can see my track record throughout the entire season. And I go through and try and find out, well, what was it about that play that was wrong? What was it about that game that just went the wrong direction that I didn't account for? And trying to, I mean, ask myself and hopefully not lose readers in the process because I'm leading them astray, but at least try and figure out, well, where, like, what's the gap, and then how do I fill that moving forward? And while it's hard to do that on a weekly basis, especially because content needs to be out essentially yesterday, when it comes to like in season content, it's easier once we're in the off season. We can kind of just take a a wide angle view at the entire season. But at least for while we're in the thick of it, it's best to try and take those bite-sized chunks, because I'm not going to remember. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going to remember what happened at the end of week one in January. That's just not going to happen. I can barely remember what happened like 2 weeks ago, let alone like what trying to have that same memory like in a couple of months. I'm going to be ready to just like not do anything after this season. But again, it's important that for our process and for understanding what matters, that we do that, so that once we're ready to, I guess, come back in or in June, July of next season, we know what matters. Like we know what we need to do in order to again figure out the NFL, or like figure out the plays that we need all over again for the 2021 season.
It's all about the process.
Always, we must trust the process.
Last week. So what did you learn from last week on your process?
So the one thing that I did learn was that I need to at least be more. Not necessarily. I guess the easy way to describe it is sticking to my guns, but there was some, I mean, some common sense nuance that kind of went with it. My top quarterback streaming option for last week was Derek Carr, and the reason why purely a process play. I mean, he was at home. Their team implied total was, I think, was just above 25 points. Tampa Bay, like while they were like very decent up front, we had just seen what they had done the week prior. Their secondary had still allowed a number of explosive plays. I believe it was when they played against the Chargers. It was their speedster, Jalen Guyton, that got behind their defense for a long play. So I could see a path for Henry Ruggs like doing well. I could see a path for, instead of Henry Ruggs, it wound up being Nelson Aguilar instead. I could see a path for Darren Waller performing well. So despite the fact that people were, I guess, coming off of the recency bias saying that Tampa Bay's defense, number one in the league, cannot be stopped. To me, I just, again, looking at my process and kind of walking through and saying like, oh, Derek Carr, I think he's popping in a lot of checking a number of the boxes that I would normally check for being a viable streamer. But of course, the common sense nuance was that their starting offensive line, goes on the COVID list on Tuesday, Wednesday. Trent Brown is out. I mean, there's no way that the starting left guard, right guard, regardless, starting offensive lineman, he was supposed to be out. The rest of the starting offensive line, they don't get activated until Friday. So, I mean, it makes sense that a lot of people would gravitate away from Derek Carr. But I still remember on Tuesday, Wednesday, I mean, when the piece first came out, the comments were just like, have you guys not seen the Buccaneers defense? Do you not see what they just did this past week? Derek Carr's terrible. All these other things. And it's just, again, sticking to the process and trying to understand, okay, well, how did I get to this recommendation? What about this player would at least put me down this path? And so looking at not just the overrating defense, but what was it about the quarterback that would also put me on it? And Derek Carr, I mean, for the past few weeks, while he hadn't been a quarterback one, I think he'd been a quarterback either 14 or 15 in points per game, like leading up to it, at least for the past few weeks. A couple of touchdowns in multiple games as well. So a number of factors were kind of pointing me in that direction. So while it wasn't anything I could just like hang over everybody's head and say, look at this. I mean, he still finished as the quarterback 12, if I'm not mistaken, this past week. So I was at least happy that the results worked out. But at least for me, it was more of a like, again, sticking to the process and understanding that, I mean, it's not just a subjective thing. There are metrics that we look for. There are statistics, again, that I use and trends that I use in order to identify what would be a viable play, like just based off of just the pool of players that you would typically look at for streaming options. So there was enough there, at least for me to say that yes, this is a possible play. But again, from a common sense standpoint, I can understand why people shied away from it.
Yeah. Plus, they're coming off a bye, which helped a little bit too.
Yeah.
What you got?
So we were talking about like hits and misses. What was your biggest preseason player that you were high or low on that you missed?
Ooh.
I would say that the player that I just outright dismissed from my consideration was I think it was James Robinson. And while we didn't get just like the complete news about like Leonard Fournette like moving and all that, it was more of like after the season started. But it was looking at the team. It was one of those, I would say, this is probably the poor term since we support the crew, but this is more like a football guy take, right? You look at Jacksonville and you're like, they're not a good team. Look at that offensive line. There's no way, how could they possibly do it? So just, again, completely dismissed, not taking into account the things that I missed. I mean, not taking into account his collegiate profile. I mean, the fact that he was a UDFA, I don't take that into account because we've seen undrafted free agents wind up like being, huge success stories within the NFL. I mean, just look at absolutely.
Eckler,
Yes.
Foster.
Yeah.
And Carson's a 7th rounder. I mean, Chris Carson.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so many success stories that like draft capital, while I do dabble in dynasty, like draft capital becomes one of the things that a lot of folks use as like for their projection models. For in-season, I mean, for redraft and all that, it doesn't really cross my mind. But still, like I looked at the team, I looked at their situation, I looked at their offensive line and said, nope, absolutely not. Now he's the RB3 in PPR leagues, I think after RB3, RB4 in points per game in PPR. So it's just, that was one of the things where I did not take the time to actually sit down and go through his collegiate profile to see that, he can actually not just run between the tackles. He's actually pretty decent as a receiver out of the backfield. So he has, multi-utility. I mean, Gardner Minshew, we've seen his struggles. The Jacksonville offense has actually still been able to move the ball on most occasions, minus that with the Thursday night debacle from like week 3 or week 4, when everybody was expecting him to be a quarterback one. Regardless, he's held, 70-80% of the rushing share with at least a 10% target share in most of his games. So these are running back one, metrics. That's a profile of a running back one. And again, that was just one of those takes where I just immediately looked at the situation, just like, no, don't want it. And then, I've been regretting it ever since.
Rhys, who's yours?
Mine will probably be, it's a tie, I think, at this point, because he did not produce last week at all. It's either Matthew Stafford or Daniel Jones. And I thought Stafford because of his tear that he was on last year before getting injured. And for Jones, I just thought he had decent weapons. He thrown 18 touchdowns in the final half of the year, only 5 interceptions. So I thought he cleaned up the turnover problem, which clearly was a mistake. I thought Jason Garrett, who, Dak didn't turn the ball over much, maybe. And I was completely wrong on that. But also I do believe Saquon's injury has affected Jones greatly. And talk about like running back injuries affecting quarterbacks. I mean, they go on the flip side too, because Dak since Dax got injured, Zeke's not doing well,
Mm-hmm.
and with Barkley getting injured, Jones is not doing well because Jones tore up the Steelers pretty bad for the Steelers at least on Monday Night Football in Week 1 when Saquon was healthy.
But that's more of what Chris was getting into. Is we got to take a holistic look at things, right? We got to say, maybe Dak is worth twice what you're offering him, because if this is the drop off, and I don't mean fancy stats, I don't mean he could.
No, this is real football.
1,000 yards. I just mean they were competitive, and now they're not. And this is not a hot take, but the Eagles, and I'm the furthest from an Eagles fan. Today I have a Rams shirt on, I'm not even a Rams fan, but I was just saying the Eagles are blow them out on Thursday night.
Sunday.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't doubt that at all. And actually, I was just writing up Michael Gallup as a drop candidate for one of my pieces for Number Fire, and looking at the Cowboys offense as a whole. What did I write down? So the Cowboys offense, they were averaging 509.5 yards of total offense per game with Dak Prescott. Without him, they are down to 243 yards of total offense per game with Andy Dalton under center. Andy Dalton has thrown how many yards? I think he was just over 300. Yeah, 306 total passing yards since he started. Dak Prescott threw for 312 yards in one half back in Week 2.
Yep.
Not good.
So for my miss was it's twofold. One, if you'd asked me, and we had this conversation, I think when Rich was on, I said Josh Allen. I called the miss too early. So now it's how our pride, we want to maybe not.
Yeah.
But my one now I want to say is Herbert. Like when I saw him at Oregon, I didn't see the guy that we see now. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he's one of my dynasty trade targets only because he's producing similar to, well, maybe not real similar, but to Kyler and Russ and
similar enough.
Yeah.
He's cheap compared to those guys because those guys have name value.
Mm-hmm. Just going to get weapons in the back, but because he hasn't played with Eckler, he's played a game and a half with Eckler. We haven't seen what he can do with full Eckler.
Right.
They probably will get weapons or an offensive lineman with their first round pick.
Right.
And then keep on blowing leads.
Anthony
be a high
Lynn.
One.
And Anthony Lynn's probably not around. I don't mean that. So everybody cheers for coaches to get bounced. I don't, because every time that happens, it takes 30 people's livelihoods and makes them coach.
Because it's not just the head coach. I mean, normally it winds up being part of the staff or a significant number of the staff. Because how can you justify your job when the guy you're working for, I mean, he also gets canned. I mean, it's hard to see how you wind up not getting the boot as well, unless you're just, a complete wonderkind or something like that. But it's a hard sell.
I just don't dig that. But I think that Anthony Lynn's probably not around the way he's mishandling late games. And and just how he handled Herbert's, I guess, transition to being the full-time starter. I mean, he was, almost dead set on Tyrod Taylor, actually, let me pronounce his name correctly, still being the starter once he came back after the punctured lung incident. And I didn't quite understand it. I know some of his comments were taken out of context, but it's hard to see. It was almost a complete night and day switch between how the offense functioned under Taylor than under Herbert. We saw a more balanced passing attack between the utilization of the running backs and the tight ends and the wide receivers. Eckler was now seeing a more robust target share. And that also filtered down to Josh Kelly and so on and so forth. But at least we saw what the Chargers offense, I would have thought they were designed to do, versus what, and also if Herbert can also bring the utility out of the as a runner as well, then what are the strong points? What's the confidence level you can have in going back to Taylor afterwards? I think that genie's out of the bottle. After that, there's really no going back. In Dynasty League last week, I overpaid for him. I was riding Fitzpatrick, and I picked up Dalton, and so I have a decent team, and so I paid Gallup in a future second, one quarterback league. So while I like Gallup and Herbert was a third round rookie pick. Mm-hmm. It's a one quarterback league, and so another league last year down the home stretch, I gave a third for Tannehill. But my whole thing is, I think Herbert's young Ben Roethlisberger, and a little bit of activity in the pocket, but in Parham and Guyton and
Mm-hmm.
Teron Johnson.
Yep.
Yep.
I mean, they just extended Keenan Allen, so he at least has him for at least another, probably, let's say, 2 seasons. I mean, Mike Williams, I mean, for as banged up as I assume he's going to get, because gosh, every time Mike Williams goes up to catch a pass, I don't know, I'm just like, and I feel like he's going to get hurt. But either way, I mean, they have at least a young core around him that I don't think the investment, like what might be, I guess, an initial overpay, I think it's going to wind up paying dividends over the next few years, because I can't see a reason, especially given the division that they're in. I mean, they're going to be pressed to continue to score. I mean, if they're going to be playing against, I mean, the Chiefs, who now, they're obviously going to be Super Bowl contenders, like once again this season. Like, I'm hoping their offensive production picks up, but either way, they're set for the playoffs. I mean, Oakland now, or not Oakland, shoot, I'd say that every time. Las Vegas, I mean, now with their younger core, I mean, they're now going to be pushing teams in order to score a bit more. So, I mean, they're in a competitive division. So I think that, I mean, given their situation, Herbert's going to be one of those guys that I don't think he's going to have time to become a quote unquote boring pocket passer. I mean, they're going to be forced into a number of, I guess, competitive games throughout like most of his career.
Yeah. Plus, what we never think of in the fantasy world, a year from now, we'll be looking at guys that have just retired or about to. I don't
Yeah.
see Brees playing next year. I don't think Brady plays past 2021.
No.
Rivers is gone.
Yep.
We can go down the list. Is Cam still going to be playing? Is
Ben Roethlisberger going to be playing?
Exactly. And so that this opens up that window where Kyler and Russ are going to be superstars, and people don't want to Watson. People don't want to admit that these guys are the future face of the NFL, the same way Brady and Eli and Roethlisberger were a decade ago.
But I do
so think, like, a lot of those values for those younger guys, they're going to spike once dynasty players realize they're not going to have those Fitzpatricks, those Roethlisbergers, those guys that you could, I mean, trade for or just acquire on the cheap, and then have as like maybe your quarterback one, or the guy that you maybe start like on bye weeks or whatever. I mean, those aren't going to be those. They're not going to be available for you as they would be. So a lot of those younger guys, I mean, I can see their value spiking over the next couple of years for sure.
Yeah.
The two things about your Herbert trade. One, in a one quarterback league, it's good that you traded him for after the bye, because
that's exactly right.
Now you don't have to worry about him, because Fitz and Dalton, you don't have to worry about that. And also, your Big Ben comparison is very accurate, especially.
We haven't talked about this before either.
No, especially because in Herbert's first game, he knocked a Chiefs defender out cold on a run.
Remember that?
So you're saying Ben has done this?
No, but he's a power player like Ben.
Yeah.
And the defense in his division, I mean, Herbert's it's not good. And I'm a Broncos fan. And so we're not good, especially if we don't have Von Miller.
No, I mean, it's gonna be a rough season, like for the Broncos. But I do think, I mean, you're spot on in the comparison and the analysis. I mean, I think over the next couple of years, I mean, let's say if I don't think Von Miller is going to retire, but either way, I mean, again, looking at the younger core that a lot of those teams in their division are starting to build. I mean, so the Broncos, at least from an offensive standpoint, next season, Cortland Sutton comes back. Jerry Jeudy's now in his second season. I mean, I can see that offense trying to take a step forward. I mean, we already talked about Kansas City and Las Vegas. So again, I mean, I think it's going to be a competitive division, and one that Herbert's going to be kind of forced into playing alongside some of the better quarterbacks in the league.
Oh yeah, I think he needs a name change, like the old Falcons. A-Bear.
Yeah.
That was before your time. What other questions you have, Chris? We're enjoying the conversation. We appreciate you.
Oh yeah,
so,
of course.
There's been a lot of rookie flashes, disappointments. What's been your biggest positive surprise?
Besides Robinson, since that genie's
yeah. The positive surprise has been, and actually one that I was hoping for, was that this 2020 draft class, at least for the wide receivers, would be as advertised. And I think in 7 weeks, they've been as advertised. I mean, Jerry Jeudy, the jury might still be out on Jerry Jeudy, especially after last week. But even this past week, I mean, Denzel Mims started to show some flashes. Um, Jalen Rager, who is like one of my like highest prospects, like coming out this season, like he flashed like before immediately getting hurt. But everybody else, I mean, from CeeDee Lamb, Henry Ruggs, I mean, we've seen Chase Claypool, obviously. I mean, we've seen at least, and this was actually a piece that I did for Roto World a couple of weeks ago. We've seen, I think, 6 wide receiver one appearances like from the rookies so far. 2 from Chase Claypool, I believe 2 from CeeDee Lamb. Not in consecutive weeks, because I think CD did it in like in weeks 2 and 4, and Claypool did it in like weeks 3, and I think it was week 6, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, I mean, for them to come out after this off season, or I guess non-off season, and I was definitely a subscriber to the idea that, I mean, the wide receiver position, with as much nuance and timing and just the fact that, I mean, you need to be like completely in sync like with your quarterback. I mean, we've talked so much over the years about the mind meld between a number of quarterbacks and the wide receivers. The mind meld between Ben Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown when that was still a thing. The mind meld between Russell Wilson and Doug Baldwin when that was still a thing. I mean, for rookies to not have that this offseason, and then to see them come out and, I mean, really have an impact right out of the gate. I mean, we're not even halfway through the season, right, and we're already talking about a number of these guys as, I mean, high dynasty value assets like coming out of the gate. I mean, that's really impressive. I mean, that's something that, with as many big names as that were a part of the 2020 draft class, I mean, and a lot of people already comparing them to the famed 2014 draft class, when we were still back in January, February. To see them and be able to watch them and to see, I mean, not just from a statistical standpoint, but we've seen highlight plays from almost all of them.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and to see that, like, just, I mean, 7 weeks into the season, I mean, that's been a very good surprise, and it just makes me, I mean, just I guess excited about the futures for all of them. I mean, even CD. I mean, I don't care about if it's Andy Dalton or was it who's it
DiNucci?
Yeah. That's going to start for him afterwards. I mean, I don't care about that as of right now, because I see what he was capable of doing with Dak Prescott in the lineup. And then now Denzel Mims, if Sam Darnold now becomes gets healthier, now he's the one leading the offense. I mean, instead of, I mean, Joe Flacco, for whatever reason. But I mean, it's just, you can start to see like what their futures hold versus some of like the dim outlook that we had back in July and August, which again, it made sense. I mean, because you need that for rookie wide receivers. But in some cases, I mean, for a lot of cases, as we've seen so far, that, I mean, that talent has really won everybody over.
I think Mims will also greatly improve once Gase exits town.
Yeah,
but we're just, I mean, how that didn't happen after, what was it, that Thursday night game when they lost to Denver. I don't understand it.
They're not trying to lose to get Trevor, I think, is what's happening.
But I want to push in on you, Chris. There are 5 guys you didn't even mention. You mentioned the top guys. There's 5 other rookies. So T. Higgins has played great.
Jefferson.
For the Bengals, that's my team. Yeah,
I know, but not even Justin Jefferson. I'll give you Justin Jefferson. I mean, Higgins, Pittman flashed some.
Yep.
My guy that I like on the Rams from Monday night, Van Jefferson, makes a great sideline catch, and I think he'll improve. I think Ayuk and Chenault are 2 others that
Ayuk definitely flashed.
But we don't even know, like, I couldn't even, like, we're laying odds on who's going to be the end receiver 1. I don't think you could go more than 50% on any one of them. It's that, because I could make a case on Jefferson or Ayuk or Chenault and that's what's so crazy and so awesome about it. I could even say Ruggs, right? I mean, I can, earlier you kind of led me to this thought of, we can make a case. Our job in the fantasy world is kind of like a lawyer. A lawyer doesn't really get he doesn't get picked who or she who walks through their door and who they're going to defend. In our case, isn't that we're going to wake up one day and we're going to go, hey, I think I need to defend Henry Ruggs, but that may be what the numbers say. And so it might be Ayuk. I mean, I could make a case that Ayuk's going to be the best fantasy guy, or T. Higgins, or
Could
Michael
be.
Pittman or Rager, who hadn't even played a snap yet, or Chenault.
I believe Rager played week 1.
Oh,
but
you're right. Before he
Yeah.
his thumb.
Yeah.
I just meant it's crazy because there's 10, 12 of those guys.
Yeah.
All right, I'm stealing one of Rhys's questions for you.
Okay.
Dynasty, top 6 rookie picks. Recount them for me like you would redraft them today.
Top 6 rookie picks from this season.
One quarterback league.
One quarterback. All right. So I would probably, let's see. I'll probably start with, let's see, Jonathan Taylor. Right after that, CEH. Probably right after that, let's see. If I'm thinking back to, so Jonathan Taylor, CEH, probably CD after that. Gosh, I'm trying to think of where I was at, like in March, April, because I was hoping like Cam Akers would be a thing.
Or Dobbins, Swift.
Swift, I think I'd probably put him because we're starting to see the breakout. The snaps aren't there yet, but it's coming. He wouldn't be in my top 6. He'd probably be like 7. But then after that, I mean, take some of the wide receivers that we listed off. I still have hope for Rager, but that's my personal bias. So I probably have Rager at 6, T at 4. Trying to think of who I probably have at 5. I don't know who I'd have at 5. I'd have to think on it. But I think
Justin Jefferson, maybe.
Probably Justin Jefferson, because I think I probably still. Again, this is personal preference. I'd still take Jefferson over Claypool. But when I was, but I guess throughout most of the draft process, if I'd had Jefferson ranked ahead of Claypool throughout the entire time. But I do see the case for moving him up at this point, though.
But think about it. We've had 3 good quarterbacks. All right, I'm already giving it to Tua because if the team thinks, all right, the report that the Dolphins are moving to Tua to save Fitzpatrick's money. Yeah, let's just set that aside and call that conjecture. But if they think Tua gives them as good or better chance to win than Fitz, we have 3 great quarterbacks. We already talked wide receivers. We have a handful of good running backs, including James Robinson. Yep. We also have Harrison Bryant. Cole Kmet looked okay the other day.
Yeah.
Dalton Keene is now starting for the Patriots. I just mean, this is a pretty good class, and we're not even talking defensively. And so, that's why I'm always leery when we think, oh, this one won't be as good as that class. This won't, all this stuff. Like people throwing away AJ Dillon. I'm like, too soon. It's too soon. I'm not saying he's good or bad. And I'm not a big Jordan Love fan, but it's too soon. People write him off. And so I don't know. We could see Jacob Eason taking over for Rivers here in 3 weeks. I mean, we don't know.
I still have a soft spot for Jacoby Brissett, but I get what you're saying.
I'm with you though. I think though they will go Brissett than Eason.
Yeah.
But I think Brissett would have a quick hook as long as they're in the playoff chase, because that division's pretty weak outside of the Titans. I mean, you get to play the Jags twice and the Texans.
Right.
And
I mean, that division's pretty much up for grabs, and especially with the expanded playoff race like this season, who knows? Coming out of that division, it might only take maybe you being at 500 to get into the playoffs.
Right. It's almost like being in the NFC least.
Yeah. Gosh.
What you got, Rhys?
So we're talking dynasty. Who would be we drafted for next season today? If we're projecting for next season, who's the redraft 1-1?
Not redraft, dynasty. Or are you saying redraft? Or
redraft 1-1.
1-1 next year.
Redraft 101?
Yes. Let's go 101, 102, 103. And the only reason I say that is because I think wherever there's a couple gimmies, one gimme, and some people would have them at 1, some would have 2, some have 3.
Okay. Let's see. I'm thinking of for next season. I don't know. I'm trying to think of who was so this season. It was CMC, Saquon, Zeke or some combination of the
Uh-huh.
three. I'm going to at least shift. I still think that CMC will be a part of that trio.
Yes.
Yes.
I still think, honestly, I still think Zeke is going to be a part of that trio next season.
Possibly.
I think. But I think the third guy in that list is going to be Alvin Kamara. I don't think it's going to be Saquon. I think it was the first article that I wrote for Football Guys. I made the case for Alvin Kamara being the RB1 on the season, just given his offensive situation, his efficiency prior to injury, and then just the I guess the tumultuous season that the Saints had with Drew Brees being in and out of the lineup, Teddy Bridgewater being a part of that offense, and then of course Kamara coming back, and you could tell that he was hampered from his broken tackle rate, just offensive efficiency, so on and so forth. So I do think there's a case for Kamara since he was I would say like RB4, RB5, like somewhere in there this season. That I would think he moves up into that top trio of running backs, that first tier of running backs for next season.
From For me, it's Alvin Kamara 1-1, McCaffrey 1-2, and the 1-3. I think it's buyer's choice between there's Barkley, Zeke. I think Derrick Henry deserves to be in that conversation at this point, as he's tearing up yards. Even Dalvin Cook, if he can get past the injuries.
Or you can make a case for Eckler or Chubb having a hot ending and being in that conversation.
Yes,
depending on when they come back. I also, what's really interesting, you guys, I agree with most of y'all's takes here, but you know what we haven't heard? We didn't hear one receiver. And
right.
Because of the depth at the position, whoever you would take at that 1-3 for a receiver, it's not that different than the receiver you'd get at 210. And so, versus the running back, now you're looking at Todd Gurley or somebody, Le'Veon Bell or somebody like that on the flip side.
Yeah. Because I think part of the issue with that is that, I mean, wide receiver target shares, I mean, unless you're projecting or just looking at the alphas at the position, which I think for this season, it was Michael Thomas, who we don't even know like what his projectable target share is going to be moving forward. But it was him. It was Devontae Adams, he was my preferred wide receiver one, like over Michael Thomas. But then after that, it's the combination of like Tyreek Hill and so on and so forth.
Nuke.
But Nuke and Nuke and most of those guys. But even still, I mean, the replaceability at the position, it's just we've seen kind of that laid bare before us after injuries to Nick Chubb, injuries to Austin Eckler, and just the replaceability. I mean, going from Nick Chubb to Kareem Hunt, okay, fine. But going from Austin Eckler to the amalgamation of Joshua Kelly and Justin Jackson, not so great for fantasy purposes.
Right.
So, I mean, not to say that you can I guess you can instantly replace Julio Jones with Calvin Ridley, but that doesn't necessarily work for every other offense like in the league or every other wide receiver combination in the league. So I will always say that, or not always say it, but I would say for the most part, running backs will just get pushed up naturally to the front of the queue, just given like their projected touch share and workload. But we just always have to try and look out for those injury situations where, or I guess a player falling out of favor with their offense, like Leonard Fournette, and then coming in, James Robinson coming in, and so on and so forth.
I will say, jump in front of him. I will say I'm a huge Fournette for the stretch run this year, including this game this week over Rojo, only because the Arians' cryptic speech. He likes having that bell cow. He doesn't want to risk fumbles.
Yeah,
maybe more name value than reality. Fine, I'm willing to admit that's a possibility. It just seems Arians likes the name value of Fournette the same way Andy Reid likes the name value of Le'Veon Bell.
Yeah, and I think that's completely fair. And I think given Leonard Fournette's like target share and how he was used, not his overall target share, but like when he was used throughout the game, like in the hurry up 2-minute drill and all that, I think there's going to be a lot more, I guess, high value targets or high value touches like coming his way. And I believe it was JJ Zachariason who put out the post like earlier on Twitter today. I mean, with some of the comments that Bruce Arians was making, and it's sounding like Leonard Fournette is moving into that James White role, like for Tom Brady. like where if he's going to be the guy that's being used in the 2-minute drill, hurry up position, like and all that, and Tom Brady's going to be giving him those short dump offs, those screen passes and whatnot over Ronald Jones. I mean, now we've got James White plus at this point, because we know what Leonard Fournette can be as a runner. So if he's also getting those targets as well, I mean, the people that drafted Leonard Fournette in the 3rd round, who like I chastised, or at least I was kind of looking at him like that's a bad pick. I mean, it could have wound up working out for them. I mean, for the most part,
if they haven't dropped him by then. But the other thing is he's one Ronald Jones fumble away from a 3-game stretch.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
The thing about, you mentioned James White, is the weapons Brady has now is I'm counting Antonio Brown and presuming a healthy Evans and Godwin, which is like, rare.
Yeah.
But that's probably his best weapons since 2007 with
at least,
Moss and Welker. And,
I could make an argument that's better now.
Right. And so you're just thinking it should be opened up for the running game. Nobody's going to put very many in the box because you got to protect the outsides.
What I was thinking back on the 101, 102, 103 conversation, the other guy that I did not hear mentioned at all that was getting some 101 love later in the fantasy season, draft season, I guess, was CEH.
Yeah, he's not. But we all fall in love, though, man. That's like when I was in college. You fall in and out of. As a son, he's giving me the side eye. But you fall in and out of love, like the And I think that's what it was with CEH, and I don't mean that bad.
No, I think the analysis it made sense. But I'm a resident Damian Williams truther. So it's been a roller coaster for me this offseason because I was adamant in May. I mean, or actually, back in like mid-February, like after the Super Bowl was done, Damian Williams, he should have been the Super Bowl MVP. I'm just gonna lay that out there.
Yep.
Just like James White should have been.
Bingo. We're right on the same page, Rhys. See, I like your son. But there was after he opts out. I mean, it just gave the push for all the CEH truthers. I mean, the 1st round draft capital truthers, the people that had scanned the press conferences and all that, saying that CEH would have been the bell cow anyway, truthers, that ammo that this is now going to happen. And his efficiency and like what he's been unable to do in the red zone, I think has been overstated, because I do think that conversation is taken away from his vision, his power, his contact balance, his burst that he has been able to show in order to at least put up the yardage totals that he has so far. It's just that he hasn't been scoring the touchdowns, which from a fantasy perspective, that's what we care about the most.
Yeah.
So I understand it. I get it. It's hard for me in an offense, again, as diverse as the Kansas City Chiefs is. I mean, if we're talking about guys like, Anthony Sherman, getting into the end zone, and he's passing to Demarcus Robinson in the end zone. I mean, if you're on an offense where Sammy Watkins is like the 3rd or 4th option in your receiving game, it's going to be hard for you to wind up getting touchdowns to begin with anyway. So I understood the idea from a workload perspective, because I think before Le'Veon Bell was on the active roster, CEH was one of only 2 backs to secure 85% of the running back touch share, along with having a 15+% target share in his offense. It was just him and Zeke. I mean, those are the only 2 that had like that workload profile. But now with Le'Veon Bell in there, that's obviously shifted back. I mean, his snaps, I think, dropped back to just below 60% this past week. Touch share fell back, I think, to about 60-70% as well. I mean, it was expected to scale back anyway. But even if Le'Veon Bell is only there for a year, let's say he just for his 1-year contract, he fulfills that or whatever, Damian Williams is still going to come back. They're still going to have Darwin Thompson there. I don't know if they're still going to wind up keeping the combination of Darrell Williams or DeAndre Washington or whomever, but I still think it's going to be, the offense is still going to feature 4 or 5 pass catchers at any point in time on the offense. So the offense was not concentrated enough for me to buy into him being higher than the 105 pick. It never made sense to me. I mean, when we were already drafting Travis Kelce at the 112, 201, or even higher than that in some cases, and this is not a knock against Sig, love him to death, but he was arguing for, this was last season if I remember correctly, but arguing for Travis Kelce to be drafted like the 107, 108 after the first round of running backs, and then like Michael Thomas was gone. Then it was like, well, then just take Travis Kelce. But we were already drafting like at least 2 Chiefs within the first like 14, 15 picks, and then Patrick Mahomes going in the 3rd or 4th. I mean, how much offensive production are you projecting for the Kansas City Chiefs as a whole? Right. And to just slot CEH in there for that workload and expect that level of production, it just always seemed a little too high, I guess, just given where his ADP was at to end the offseason.
Well, especially since Mahomes, it's name value, right? He had a great 2018, but 19, I know he was injured, but on a points per game basis, he was still only like QB6.
Oh,
right.
I don't mean that badly. I just mean it isn't the high volume, throw it 100 times a game offense that some teams have had in the past. Mm-hmm. And so that's the other part that I think is a flaw in the logic for CEH. I think he is what he is. We're trying to make him something he's not. People that compare, Andy Reid has a defined role, and people say, okay, he's Brian Westbrook. I'm like, okay. But Brian Westbrook was never a top 5 PPR running back. He always slotted in that 6 to 15 range or something.
Right.
And was consistent, catch passes, great back. I don't mean to say anything negative. I just mean the Brian Westbrook that we saw then wasn't in the same hemisphere as the Barkleys, the Zekes, the Camaras, the McCaffreys that we see now.
Right. And I think with Saquon Barkley, it was especially his RB1 season. I mean, that was in a concentrated offense. I mean, they were missing Sterling Shepard. They didn't have Darius Slayton at the time. Odell Beckham was injured that year. It was a concentrated offense. Ezekiel Elliott, I mean, again, another example of high touch share, but in another concentrated offense. They didn't have Cedric Wilson, Noah Brown, CeeDee Lamb. I mean Dalton Schultz. I mean, running out there, running targets, like taking passing receptions away from him. I mean, again, it was a concentrated offense. We knew going into this season that CEH was not going to be a part of a concentrated offense. It was a great offense. I mean, the offensive situation, it couldn't get any better for a rookie running back coming into the league. But from a production standpoint, I don't know how we could have, again, I guess, feasibly projected him for, I guess, an RB1 finish, just given the fact that we're always looking for, we're always expecting, I guess, touchdowns to go to Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, a splash play from maybe Mecole Hardman, maybe Sammy Watkins streaking down the sideline. I mean, it could be any one of those guys, plus a big guy touchdown, from one of the offensive linemen at some point as well. I mean, it could be any one of those guys any week for the Kansas City Chiefs. So if that's the case, how can we reliably, again, put CEH in that same conversation as those guys? And it never made sense to me.
But for CEH, the one thing he did have going for him was CBS showed this graphic. I was shocked at first. But CEH going into week 7 led the NFL in scrimmage yards.
Mm-hmm.
But not enough touchdowns. See, the
not
whole
enough
thing
touchdowns.
about the
That's what I'm
NFL
saying, yeah.
is you have to have the trifecta of scrimmage yards, catches, touchdowns. And that's what Zeke has always been good at. I know we can talk about efficiency. We can talk about any of that.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. He had volume. And that made up the other ones.
That's what Gurley also had that back in 2019, 2018, 2017.
Yep.
He was efficient in the first 2 years, but in 2019 he wasn't efficient. Yet he still got a ton of touchdowns.
And that's all that people cared about.
That's all that matters.
You could see, I mean, who was it? Ben Baldwin on Twitter. I mean, he would post, just threads of these gaping holes for Todd Gurley to run through. And it's like, it didn't matter like what talent he did or didn't possess, because at that point, I mean, the damage was already done. Fantasy managers were already looking at their box scores and seeing Todd Gurley, 17 for 86 and 2 touchdowns. And that was basically your baseline for almost every single game, because he would just be put in just the plus matchups, the plus situations that it didn't take talent to succeed, because the offense that he was a part of put him in that position to win. Whereas in CEH's example, I mean, that offensive line, I mean, with their starting guard, opting out to the season. They've had some injuries as well. They don't have that same push. We saw that in week 6 that he was capable. I mean, that they were capable of doing it, but it's been kind of up and down throughout the entire season as they shifted stuff around. So again, I think that going back to a point I made earlier is that all of the talk of him not getting touchdowns has drowned out any of the skills that we thought he had coming into the league. Burst, contact balance, being able to catch passes out of the backfield, decent route runner. I mean, any of those things has just been gone by the wayside because we always focus in on what he's capable of doing in those 1 to 2 yards that matter, and that's right before you step over the goal line.
And if he scored those, we wouldn't have that.
We wouldn't care.
We wouldn't be having it.
We wouldn't care. Like what was it? When was it week 1 or week 2 when he had those 4 or 5 tries for within the red zone he couldn't convert? If he had converted just one of those, we wouldn't be talking about this at all.
Right.
And everyone would be like, well, we'll see what Le'Veon Bell does and how much it's going to affect him or whatever. But everybody still reverts back to that game. And they're just like, well, remember those touches? I mean, I think it was, the stat was he had 10 touches from within the 10 with 0 conversions.
Yes.
Jordan Howard has more conversions within the 10 than he does. And we all know that, but we know that Jordan Howard isn't a viable fantasy asset. We know but having that skill, or I guess having that skill is a reflection on your talent. But still, it's something that fantasy managers and just the NFL media at large goes back to.
Right. Maybe we're measuring. Let me put it this way. We talked about stats earlier. Mm-hmm. We need to have stats that align with what we're measuring and what fantasy success, like a little logic trail for what fantasy success is.
Right.
To your point, volume is. Rhys, go ahead.
Well, in my book,
my book,
gotta plug it.
And I thought that the running backs last year for Kansas City, I believe they were not running backs, but just in general, Chiefs had 16 rushing touchdowns. Right. With a very high rushing touchdown percentage. So I thought the Raiders and the Saints would have a lot more touchdowns this year because they had a low touchdown percentage last year.
Regression. Backwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Believed in regression for that. And so I was talking about how much Kamara and Jacobs would positively regress and how it's easier to bet on their floor than Hilaire ceiling. And I believe a lot of people were drafting Hilaire based off his like 99% of the 1% of what would happen versus the 99% of what would not.
We all tell ourselves lies, Rhys. I'm just telling you that now. Yep. We all tell ourselves lies.
Yes.
I get up in the morning, I'm like, the hair's not as thin as you think it is, son. And yes, it is. And so we all tell ourselves lies. And so we have time for one more question. Chris, it's great having you on. We thank you for your time. What you got for the last question for him?
Probably the biggest story of the year. For the NFL at least, how's the NFL handling COVID? How well do you think?
Ooh, that is a loaded question if I've ever heard one. How do I answer this without going off on a complete tangent?
Let me set you up. The NFL sees success as playing all the games. That's their only measure of success.
Yes. And that was kind of where I think that was the first point I was going to bring up, is that I believe let's start with the positives. So I think that's probably the best place to start. I do think that they've put in the right safety protocols within the teams, players, and personnel, so that they are, constantly testing. The monitors that they've had the players and coaches wear in order to make for them to get into the facility, practice together, so on and so forth. I think, and also the game day protocols for the most part have kept everybody safe. And I do think that looking at things from a statistical perspective, them having with as much travel as has been involved and the number of players, personnel from each team that gets involved on a weekly basis, for them to have so few positive cases given the total number of people involved in the league, I do think that that's impressive. I will give them the proper due for that. I mean, what I've preferred that they try and come up with a number of hub cities for players to travel to, and they can just conduct games at a few sites, fairly similar, but just like an expanded version of what the NBA did. Yes, given the amount of time that they had to plan, given what they just watched the NBA do, I mean, without any issues, it just seemed like it was a complete blunder on their part to not try and do this. So, but the fact that again that they've only had so few relative to the the size of the league, I do think that that's impressive.
Because
Now, with that out of the way, the fact that they are unwilling to be flexible in terms of bye weeks,
Yes.
extending the season
I'm there.
past 17 weeks, uh, just the I guess the cascade of schedule changes that they've made in order to force the season into what they deem to be like as for as long as they're willing to take it. I think that's a very one poor planning on their part. I think it's put the players at a complete disadvantage, and for the players that have tested positive come on and come off the COVID list, I don't think that we're at a point with our understanding of the virus at all to understand what those long lasting effects are. I mean, the Raquel Armstead story aside, I mean, there should be, I mean, while he denies it, I really do think we need to stop and take a look at what's happening to Cam Newton and think again, he's saying he's fine, the team's saying he's fine, but he's not fine. I think there's something that we just don't understand yet about the long lasting effects of COVID. And for athletes that have to use their bodies to their maximum potential, that we're not factoring into this. And without that time that we would need in order to figure out, I mean, what's happening to a player and how they're responding to either treatment or just going back to their regular day job, which is to be a professional athlete. Without having that ability to do so, I think the league has kind of put themselves and like it's put the players at a point where, I mean, because people are, I mean, well, Cam just got benched.
Yep.
I mean, everybody's going back to, well, I remember when, I'm old enough to remember when Cam Newton was going to take over the league and the Patriots were going to, go to the Super Bowl. I mean, all those things that like, all the haters, quote unquote,
Yes.
are coming out of the woodwork. And again, I think it goes back to, again, our lack of understanding about the virus and trying to push through this season at such a wild rate. And we've seen, it's just, to me, it's kind of mind boggling. And with, what was it? The Darren Waller charity event back in week 4, to me, it seems clear that some of the players just aren't taking it as seriously as we would like to. So I don't know. It's hard for me to say that the league has done it well when from top to bottom, it doesn't feel like that the entire group, I mean, players, personnel, coaches, front office members, they haven't completely bought in. Where with the NBA, we saw from top to bottom, I mean, you're either in or you're out. I mean, Lou Will goes to, the strip club for chicken wings, he's out. I mean, we saw that happen. And so it's just, but we don't see the same consequences for players that are doing this for the NFL. And it's just, it's hard to reconcile. And it's the humanity part of me is just like, while we're cheering and watching, these players play in more or less empty stadiums, unless it's the Saints who are fighting to have people in the stands. It's hard to reconcile like those two things as so many other people are being affected by this.
Well, you mentioned like the personnel people, but even the people who load the baggage onto the plane or busted someplace, those people are touching the bags that the players will then touch.
And they're getting this close. So he mentioned 3 things that I want to push in on, or if you might. If they'd have gone to an 18 or 19 week and had 2 or 3 buys just to give themselves flexibility, they would have had more TV revenue because they would have more weeks.
Yeah.
Right. Make up for stand radio revenue.
Yeah. So revenue from the stands. Second of all, we see this as 1,600 guys. So if I had 16 people random at that age, right? Under 30 dudes making decent money, they're a hard group to control the way the NFL wants to control them. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Migrate's hard to control.
Yeah. They're like, but I just meant, the Waller charity event, that doesn't surprise me. Or, like and you could go as far as coaches, right? Gruden,
Yeah.
Gruden's like his own guy, and he's like, I don't care, I'll pay
Right.
the fine. All I mean though is you can't throw these edicts down and say the thou shouts on these guys. These
Right.
are guys that they have to buy in, and you have to get the yes, we're willing to because we think this helps us.
Right.
And lastly, the one part of the equation that I want to make sure is thought through is the career span of all these guys is pretty small. So we talk about Raquel Armstead. He may not play again, and he as a running back, his career span was average 3 years anyway, and now he lost one to this.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. It's just a complex issue. It's kind of like everybody that wants to talk about politics or whatever else. Everybody's binary and say yes this or no that, and I think it's on a spectrum, and we just have to have these contextual conversations and say it may not be as simple as we are trying to make it. And the NFL is trying to, their only goal is, can we play 16 games in 17 weeks? The fans are going to watch. The stats I always throw out, Chris, and this boggles my mind. And you've heard me say this many times, Rhys, is you go look at TV revenue per Fox, per CBS, per Monday Night Football, Sunday Night Football. It's more than the salary cap. It's more than the salary cap. So they are plus money for a game's ever played without anybody in the stands.
Right.
So, they're very much induced, let's play them all. Let's play them all. And, that's my whole thing on this, is that this is a contextual conversation. And so he threw you a high and tight one. And so it's a great conversation.
Yeah.
To start having is like, if we're saying, how can we do better? Who says COVID-20 is not going to be here in 2023?
And I mean, that's just, and who's to say like what the next time, and hopefully, I mean, I pray that this is not something that our generation or the next generation has to deal with. But I mean, just look at the conversations that we started having, or at least the fantasy community in general or just the football community started having in general over the past few weeks. So what was it? When the Titans game from a couple weeks ago could have been rescheduled. I think it was the Titans and Bills game, maybe. But either way, it turned out that it was an assistant coach was the one that wound up testing positive for COVID, hadn't been in the facility for a couple of weeks. So it was less likely that the players had it. And so like, that's what the developing story was. It went from somebody within the Titans had it, then it was a coach, then it was a assistant coach, then it was the assistant coach that had been in the facility for a while. And just the responses to the story details was like, oh, well, it's just an assistant coach, so it's not a player, so it's not a big deal. Oh, it was assistant coach that hasn't been in the facility in a while, so we still get to watch the games. And it's like, again, the humanity part in me is like, again, but guys, this is a person that now their life, their family is now being affected by this virus. And the only thing we care about is being able to watch this game for 2.5 hours. It's like, what are we doing?
Right.
I mean, just the context, or I guess the way that we're rationalizing this in our heads, to me, it just, I don't know, at times it just seems kind of broken in how we kind of dismiss like the details that kind of, I guess, might take away from the things that we enjoy, when at the same time, so many people's lives are being impacted by this that are part of the game that we want to try and, cherish for these 16, 17 weeks. So it's very difficult to I guess, to rationalize in my head.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like the concussion thing, and that's a whole different ball of wax. It's I've had too many in my life, and I
haven't had any.
Be thankful, son. And so all I mean is, we don't know the consequences until far down the road.
Yeah.
And by then, these guys that we've rooted for wearing our jersey, they're out of sight, out of mind, and we've forgotten about them as people. And now we look at them as a news story, and not that here's a guy trying to make the best decisions for his life, his family. Let's root him on instead of all the other stuff. But anyway, that got serious quick. Chris Allen, we thank you for being a part of the show, and we'd love to have you back possibly later in the season if you can find time. Chris Allen, where can people that listen to this, where could they find your work?
So you can find me. So this is like my own nickname for myself is I'm the Thanos of fantasy football, because you can find me. I'm collecting websites like Infinity Stones. You can find me on Twitter first and foremost at Chris Allen FFWX. I write the quarterback streaming column over at 4for4. I have the drop targets and weather report over at Number Fire. I have the lessons learned column over at Football Guys, and then I also have the Thursday news recap over at Rotor World. So you can find me at a number of different places. But if you disagree with anything, come yell at me on Twitter at Chris Allen FFWX.
Sounds great. Have a great one, everyone. And fantasy football never stops. So we're only halfway through after this week.
Thank you for being on the show.
Anytime, fellas.